And this next plenary sessions will be on drivers of the current research system. And to preside the sessions, we now introduced Tony Meyer from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this third plenary session of the World Conference. You will have noticed that we are sharing this hotel and conference center with some huge heavyweights. You may have seen these guys wandering around. The world's strongest man, they're going to pull bulldozers 100 meters with their teeth or by their ears or whatever. However, in this case, we also have a lineup of heavyweights, but they are intellectual heavyweights, and that makes all the difference. So I'm very pleased to be able to chair this particular session. I should remind you that these are straight presentations and there are no Q&A periods. If you want to follow up with any of the speakers, then please do so, because of course there will be a short break. But I must also remind you that this isn't the final session. It may be the last plenary of the day, but it's not the final session. We then have a series of concurrent sessions which follow on after this. So without more ado, on the theme already announced of drivers of the current research system, to speak on a series of engagement activities exploring the culture of scientific research in the UK. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ottoline Leiser, University of Cambridge, UK.
So thank you very much to the organisers for the opportunity to speak here. I'm going to talk about a project that I worked on last year with the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. At the time I was the Deputy Chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, but my day job is as a plant developmental geneticist at the University of Cambridge. And I think a lot of the issues I'm going to be talking about that came up in the report are maybe in detail UK related, but the general overview, particularly from what we've heard earlier today, I think will be relevant much more broadly. And indeed, of course, we know the research system is a global system, and the kinds of pressures and drivers that we've identified through our UK-based project, I think, absolutely translate. So let's see, if I hit this, what happens? So the project that I'm going to talk about was run by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. The Nuffield Council on Bioethics is probably most famous for producing substantive reports discussing ethical issues arising from new technologies or new integrations of technologies in biology and medicine. And on top of that, though, they carry out projects that are much more cross-cutting, and this project on research culture very much fitted into this cross-cutting theme. And the council got interested in this issue precisely because through producing a range of big reports on new technologies, they identified a common theme across many of them that they felt were driving poor practice in the research system. And a lot of that was to do with a pressure to make spectacular overclaims about how new technologies are going to solve all the world's problems immediately. And this is not helpful when you're trying to develop a new technology or implement an ethical pathway for its adoption. And then on top of that, various partners with whom we've worked over the years had become anxious about the high-profile cases of research misconduct or fraud that obviously hit the media regularly. And in discussing this with the UK learning societies, this was clearly a common problem. And so, led by the Nuffield Council, there was a steering group consisting of members from, or staff members from the various learning societies to take forward a project looking at the culture of research in the UK and how that might contribute to these problems in research ethics that were emerging. So the project aim was, as it says here, to foster a constructive debate amongst all those involved in scientific research about the culture of research in the UK and the effect that that culture has on the ethical conduct in science and the quality value, and accessibility of research. And all these things, I think, go very, very strongly together. I think it's important to consider the whole research system rather than to pick individual topics, because it's a systemic kind of problem. And one of the things I've been interested about in this conference is the way people who've come into this area from the lab floor, so to speak, bring with them their research discipline. So we heard a very kind of demographic approach to thinking about this problem this morning from a demographer, and I'm a developmental biologist, and I'm interested in the relationship between different levels of organization in biology, how interactions between molecules, interactions between cells contribute to the organism, and how that feeds back onto the cells and the molecules. And this is very much what's going on in the research system. You've got individual researchers working in research groups, universities, institutes, and they're interacting with different levels of organization, and it's those interactions and the feedbacks in the system that I think drive the system into a place where the quality and ethics in the system are not what people would like it to be, and how to shift those things back into a place where we would like it to be requires looking at that whole system and those feedbacks. You can't do it in a top-down way, you can't do it only in the bottom-up way, you have to take a systemic and integrated approach. So what we really wanted to do was to try to get some data, some information on what people working in the research system were feeling. So how they thought things were going, what motivated them, what they felt the drivers in the systems were that were either supporting or not supporting them in their ambitions. And so we did several things. We produced this online survey of relatively short, it was only 26 questions. We had a very impressive response. Nearly 1,000 people voluntarily signed up and took the survey, and the breakdown of the kinds of people involved can be seen on this list. It was completely voluntary, which has its own problems. It was very heavily dominated by research in higher education institutions, which doesn't reflect the full research system, but certainly the part of it where the Nuffield Council classically works, so that's maybe not surprising. And it was heavily dominated by early career researchers, but again, that does reflect the system. There are more people in that early career space than higher career space. We also held a whole range of discussion events across the UK, and this was a kind of more qualitative way of collecting data, I guess. And so we had events at 15 different places across the UK, many speakers putting their points across, and there were, again, nearly 700 people who came to those discussion events to contribute, and we captured those, and there's a report detailing the outcomes of those discussion events and a detailed analysis of the survey that you can get from the Nuffield Council website, along with our summative analysis or report of what we think the main issues are. And then beyond that, we had some discussion events with particular stakeholders in the system, other than the researchers, so the funding bodies, the publishers, and academics from the social scientists who work in this kind of research, the sort of sociology of research. So taken what I've said, that this was self-selecting participants, biased towards HEIs, and a lot of biomedical early career researchers, some of that doesn't reflect the full system. The bias towards early career biomedical scientists does reflect the system, but nonetheless I think it's important to keep in mind that this is not a massively rigorous scientific survey, but nonetheless I think there's enough richness, I suppose, in the data that it provides a really useful source of information about what really is going on the ground. So what did we hear? So I think the very positive messages were that people coming into research, these junior researchers, are really motivated to do fantastic quality science for wonderful reasons. So when they were asked to pick from a list of things about what high quality research was, people said it was rigorous, accurate, original, honest, and transparent. Most of these words that we've heard today very much in the context of high quality science. There's a big consensus about this is what science is supposed to be like. And when people were asked why they did science, it was because they wanted to improve their understanding. They were driven by curiosity. They wanted to make discoveries that would benefit society, and they wanted to kind of improve the sum of human knowledge. So again, these are, I think, fantastic motives with which nobody would argue. So the people coming into the system are wonderful people who want to do the right thing. So then the question is, what goes wrong? Apart from selecting just from this list, we also asked people what they thought in a more qualitative way contributed to a high-quality research environment that would support them in these excellent ambitions that they had. And they identified a number of things, but the ones that came up most often were the ability to collaborate with others, an openness in discussion of their science and sharing of their data. Multidisciplinarity, they said, was extremely important, and creativity was very much the lifeblood of science. So again, all wonderful things that we've heard about today, but all things where potentially the current system is somehow not supporting these ideals. So what's wrong with the current system? So some overarching themes came up, and one of the things that I think is common throughout the analysis is that some overarching themes came up. There are some big words that you can put out there and say these are a problem, but every single one of them is not only a problem, it's also a plus. And I think competition is very high on that list. Everybody acknowledges that competition is an inevitable and indeed an important component in science. There isn't enough money to do all the experiments people want to do. You've got to have some kind of competition to fund the experiments that are judged by some mechanism to be the ones that give you better value for your limited resource. And so on the one hand, competition is great. It potentially brings out the best work, brings out the best in people, makes them strive to do a good job. But on the other hand, it has some very negative consequences. And I think this comes up also, we've heard already a little bit in the context of gender. I tend to frame competition in terms of trying to do the very best science that I can, and I don't like framing it in terms of kicking your colleagues as hard as you possibly can so that you can stand on top of them. But those two aspects of competition, nonetheless, are there in the system. If there are winners, there are probably losers, and that's an issue. So there are problems with competition in that if it's too intense and the rules for the competition not right, it can potentially drive corner cutting, poor quality research practices, can reduce collaboration because you don't want to share stuff with your competitors, and it can result in ridiculous overclaiming because you're trying to boost yourself up the kind of ranking. So when it comes to this topic of competition, obviously that it's competition for something, and one of the main things that scientists are competing for is funding, and as I say, a key issue is the rules of the game. And I think there's a feeling in the system at the moment that because of the current spectacular constraints on funding, that funders are not necessarily rewarding the right things. I should say a lot of this is perception, and when you go and look at what funders are actually funding or map it directly onto the behavior of funders, you get a completely different picture. And so I think this is a key part in the system, is that what people think is happening, the way they think they are being judged, quite often doesn't match the rules against which they officially are being judged, but nonetheless it drives the perverse behaviors that people don't like. So I think this is a key point. We have to understand what people think the system is doing, and it may not be the same as what the system thinks it's doing, but both those people in charge of the system and those people responding to the system need to appreciate that that mismatch might be there, it might be real, and it might be a really important component in driving the perverse behaviors. So there's a view that the current funding system is causing a loss of creativity and innovation. It's funding safe stuff that's narrowly focused with kind of short-term goals, and that it's disproportionately awarded to people who have lots of funding already. So there's a feeling that more junior researchers are being penalised. Now, as I said, UK funding bodies actually, when you look, provide quite a wide range of grants that cover the full spectrum, and the criteria they say they're using are not those that the researchers think they're using. but somehow there's a breakdown in communication or a breakdown in trust in the system so that people are not appreciating that. And that's something that I think, as I say, is an important part that needs looking at. Across the piece again on this kind of assessment, there's assessment for funding, and then a lot of the criteria that people think they're being judged on are very much to do with the publication outputs that they produced. And so there's a huge issue around journal articles and how people perceive the system is driving and rewarding particular publication practices. So there is a incredibly strong and universal feeling that in order to be a successful researcher who wins funding and gets tenure and gets promoted and gets fellowships, you are required to publish in a very specific set of high impact factor journals. And this is considered to be a big problem, and I think it is a big problem. This leads to, as we've heard a lot already in this meeting, negative results not being published at all because there's no incentive to do it. Potentially disincentives for the sorts of research that might be more difficult to assess, like multidisciplinary research, all these kind of authorship wars that we've heard about, lack of recognition for anything that isn't a particular sort of journal article, and lack of recognition for being nice to other people. It's all about the individual and whether your name is first or last on the Nature paper. That's what people think is going on. And one of the things that people felt in the system, which actually, much to my surprise, I haven't heard mentioned in this conference so far, is DORA, which is the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment that came from the US Society for Cell Biology, that is a really nice summary of why journal impact factors should not be used to assess the equality of the research of individuals. And I think across the board, there is this interesting tension. People want there to be kind of transparent, open ways to assess the quality of research, but people confuse that with quantitative methods. If you're assessing the quality of somebody's research, it is qualitative. The clue is in the word. And you will not be able to find some straightforward quantitative measure of the quality of somebody's research. And particularly devolving the responsibility to some random journal and the kinds of papers it publishes beyond the one paper you're talking about is an extremely poor way to assess the quality of somebody's research. And I think this is a key problem in this current system. So in the UK as well, there is another use of the word impact, which is a huge issue at the moment. And that issue relates to the impact of your research in the sense of the impact it has on the real world. So there's a lot of perceived pressure to do research that delivers economic or social benefit, and that is considered to be a problem in constraining, for example, curiosity-driven research or driving exaggerated claims in grant proposals. And by the time you're publishing in these high-impact journals and at the same time starting a multi-million-pound company, there's a feeling that the other professional activities that all good scientists should do, like providing high-quality training and supervision to PhD students rather than treating them as lab slaves, or doing interesting public engagement activities, or contributing to the wide range of professional bodies and organizations that support the science system, such as working for funders or doing really excellent peer review for journals. All those other activities, it's felt, are undervalued. You don't really get any brownie points for doing those at all, and that is a problem for the incentives in the system. So at the heart of many of these things is the peer review process. So I know that this is going to be discussed in detail in the coming up presentation, so I perhaps whiz through this a little bit more quickly, but there's a feeling that whilst on the one hand peer review, rather like democracy, is the worst possible system except for all the others, because it's the worst system except for all the others, it basically has a positive contribution to make. And there are concerns about inappropriate reviewer behaviours, shortage of high-quality peer reviewers, not enough time, too much time pressure in academia for people to do a good job. But there are a number of initiatives going on in the system now to look at alternative mechanisms for peer review, and also to provide for peer reviewers better training. In the UK, there's a big issue around a thing called the REF, which is the Research Excellence Framework, which is a national research assessment competition that happens on a approximately 7-year cycle, and is the mechanism by which essentially the central government assesses the overall quality of research in universities and uses that to allocate its block grant to all universities. So we have essentially no private universities in the UK. All of them get a great big block grant, partly for teaching and partly for research. The research part is now allocated proportional to the performance in this thing called the REF. The thing called the REF is very high on the list of the mismatch between what people think it says and what it actually says. So the REF requires that each researcher submits 4 papers, and there is a spectacular emphasis amongst researchers on the terrible pressure there is to produce 4 Nature papers over that 7 years. Otherwise, horrible things will happen to them, and their institutions will not promote them and will put them under terrible performance management systems and so on and so forth. And in fairness to the researchers, there is some evidence that that really is what's going on. But actually, the REF assesses, yes, those 4 papers. It explicitly forbids the use of journal impact factors in assessing the quality of what's in those papers. So there shouldn't be pressure to publish in particular journals. And on top of assessing the papers, there's a big qualitative assessment of research environment that is all about exactly the kinds of things we're talking about at this conference, how you support career development for researchers, how you support high quality research with integrity, these kinds of things. And then now there's also an assessment of this impact agenda, which again, researchers are taking very much as another thing they had to do, rather than the opportunity to demonstrate that their research or their activities as professionals contributes more widely than just a Nature paper. So it's there, it's important, it has very powerful effects in the research culture, but how those effects match onto the actual goals for the REF is very difficult to see. And I think that again is this mismatch that's an important factor in the system. So there's a feeling very much that the REF is driving this pressure to publish in particular journals, and it is doing things like disadvantaging multidisciplinary research. So there are a number of research governance and integrity issues ongoing in the UK, which are aimed at addressing these kinds of systems. The pressure in the system, there is evidence that it's leading to problems. So quite a high proportion of the respondents in the survey said that they had felt either tempted or under pressure to cut corners or behave in ways that they didn't really think that was appropriate. This is more the case with junior researchers than with more senior researchers. And it's this hyper-competition and pressure to publish that are driven to be a major cause. And there's a requirement for institutions to create an environment with better mentorship, where ethical conduct was better, was at the forefront, I suppose, further at the forefront of the system. Workload is a big issue, and this the reason that people feel so pressured in the system in general is the overall workload and the difficulty in navigating an academic career. And this is felt to be leading to all these kinds of issues. There is a feeling that there's a loss of talented individuals from academia, but at the same time I think that the exciting possibilities for careers outside academia are underrepresented in academia, and they contribute to the pressure because as we heard this morning, the pressure is that the system is very driven by fear. Unless you do this, you'll lose your job and your life will be over. And that's not the case. There are many wonderful things you can do outside the academic system. And so this, I think, very much contributes to the gender disparities in the system. I have a mantra that women are too scared to stay in and men are too scared to get out, because they respond differently to that fear component in the system. So we need different and broader criteria for recruitment and promotion of individuals. We need high quality mentoring and career advice inside and outside academia. We need to get rid of this idea that if you take a job outside academia, you've failed and dropped out in some way, you're probably going to be doing something far more useful than those of us staying in our labs, popping the lids off Eppendorf tubes all day. And that's, I think, particularly important to create a diverse environment, an environment where diversity is supported, which is very important for research creativity. And so good employment practices for diverse people, I think, really important. Okay, so to sum up, there is widespread agreement that competition is a double-edged sword, and at present we're in an era of hyper-competition. The rules for winning the perceived competition are disproportionately focused on a very small number of measures that are not the things that really constitute high-quality research, and that this potentially drives and incentivizes poor research practice. And this is something that came over very powerfully. Absolutely all the stakeholders in the system said there was nothing they could do about it and it was somebody else's fault. All of them. The researchers said, no, it was the universities or the funders that were doing it. The funders said, oh, we're trying very hard, but nobody listens to us and they don't understand a word we say. And this was something that I found really striking in this project. And it's something we seriously have to move, and is why initiatives like this conference are really cheering, because there are many people here from all those different organizations wanting to do their bit. So hopefully an outcome of this project is having engaged at least a chunk of the UK research community in working together to tackle this problem. So there are suggestions in the report for all the stakeholders. Those suggestions come down to diversifying the assessment system with high quality communication and training and recognition, and to promoting the kind of open collaborative research culture with embedded ethics that everybody coming into the system in the first place says they want. And I'm running out of time, but if you want to find the full write-up of the project, both the detailed write-up from the discussion events and the survey, but also our overall conclusions and summary of the system, you can go to the Nuffield Council on Bioethics webpage, where it's all available for free. Thank you very much.
A very interesting survey from the UK, but I think, as you heard, these are applicable across the whole world. We can all recognize the same issues. Otterline mentioned the review system, and now we move into a more a presentation particularly on this, the power, perils, and pitfalls of peer review in public. Very nice alliteration. This will be given by Professor Philip Moriarty, University of Nottingham in the UK. And Philip is a mobile speaker, I believe. So over to you.
I'll take this off if that's okay. I drink an awful lot of coffee, so staying rigid to one spot I find very difficult. Also, I'm, like Otterline mentioned, I'm actually a jobbing scientist. This is a bit of a sideline in terms of speaking at a conference like that. Just so I can get an idea of the sort of scope of the audience and what you do, would you mind putting your hand up if you consider yourself an active research scientist? Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm going to tell you not about the results of a study. This is very much a personal discussion, a polemic, or if you will, a rant on issues that we have with peer review. Peer review indeed is, like democracy, the best of a very bad bunch, or the least of many evils. Could we do it better? And could we do it better using sites like PubPeer? The idea that the way a paper gets published is that you send it out to a number of anonymous referees, and on the basis of their say-so, it gets into the literature. In this day and age, you know, in terms of social media, it's something could be seen as very archaic. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. However, of course, as it says in the title, there are many perils and pitfalls we need to worry about. Let's see if this is going to work. Okay, good. So the day job, just to let you know, I work on basically single atom manipulation. Those blobs that are moving around about at the moment are single atoms. We image single atoms, single molecules, we manipulate them, we do spectroscopy. That's the day job. So in that sense, compared to biomedical researchers, for example, I work with inorganic silicon. That's the substrate I use. The ethical issues aren't there. The ethical issues arise in terms of all the things we've heard about in terms of publication, peer review, pressures on researchers, etc. So there were two great, really great plenary talks this morning, and I jotted these down because they really cut to the heart of a lot of what I'm going to talk about. The first is, as you can see, from Lex Buter. Sloppy science is a larger evil than research misconduct. Now, I would say, I agree sort of with much of that, I would say that perhaps evil, given that sloppy science is generally not done with malicious intent. It generally is just sloppy. Perhaps evil is too strong a word. Problem. Sloppy science is a larger problem than research misconduct is certainly something that I would fully agree with. The second point is really important as well, and this was from Brian. There's a huge underestimation of the importance of fear as a driver. That is absolutely key. I've heard lots about how we need to educate more of the young researchers to tell them what's right and what's wrong. Look, they've been through many years of undergraduate. If they do not know what plagiarism is now, they're never going to know what plagiarism is. If they do not think that, well, actually, I shouldn't really delete 50% of my data and skew it, they're never going to take it on board. There are drivers, huge drivers in the system. And the key one, I would argue, is exactly that. I need to cut corners to advance my career. This is from, we heard some great statistics from Brian. I'm a physicist. And this was from Adrian Sutton at Imperial College. Oh, sorry, let's get that. Imperial College in last month's Physics World. And this is the key, obviously the thing highlighted in yellow. If we think about the average turnover of staff, in that, you know, I might have a 40-year career or something like that, and until I pop my clogs, I'm not going to leave a hole in the system for another researcher to get into that hole. On average, as you can see, 36 appointments will be made annually to postdocs in the UK, or 1.7% of the postdoc population. There was a study done by the Royal Society, which Arlene probably remembers, a couple of years ago, where they asked PhD students what their aspirations were. And 50%, at about the midway point, wanted to go on to an academic career. There are going to be an awful lot of very frustrated and very disappointed researchers. This is the key driver. So, where are the problems? How do they manifest? Well, you know, we've got somebody, or a number of people actually, from Attraction Watch in the audience. It was great to listen to Avon's talk this morning. Many examples of where peer review is badly failing. Outright fraud gets through the net, so completely computer-generated gibberish gets accepted for conferences. How many of you, just again a show of hands, it's like talking to an undergraduate class. How many of you are familiar with this paper? Okay, for those of you who aren't, get ready for a treat. Right, this is the worst. This is exactly in my research area. This is one of the worst, well, the worst, I would say, example of data manipulation that certainly I've come across. So those little black things that you can see in the image over here, this is a transmission electron microscope image, are nanorods. We don't have to worry about them. They're small particles of gold, which, as you can see, look like rods, about 50 nanometers across. And a paper was published in Nano Letters, which many in the nanoscience community would consider sort of the next tier down, if we are going to talk about those hierarchies, from Science, Nature, etc. You know, a top-class, prestigious journal published by the American Chemical Society. This paper apparently walked into that journal. And as a researcher, you look at that image and you go, that's remarkable. What the heck is going on there? Why do they form those shapes? Why don't they just form a sort of random distribution across the surface, given that these particles have been deposited from a solvent? And so then this was highlighted, as you can see, on the ChemBark website. Remember, it walked through peer review. And please work. There we go. Take a close look at that. Just if you don't see it, I'll highlight it. Right? So I showed this to my 10-year-old daughter, and her exact words were, "Daddy, why didn't they use the lasso tool?" And this walked through peer review into one of the most prestigious journals there are in nanoscience. Thankfully, this was retracted, but it was retracted not because of a long, protracted letter to the editor, back to the author. The author goes, oh, I better try and cover my tracks, etc., that takes 2 years. It was pulled because of the pressure of social media. It was pulled because of that Ken Bark blog. Again, another show of hands, just to keep you alert at this time of the day. How many of you are familiar with the Hendrik Schön case? Okay, interesting. Not so many. So this was for physicists. This was a really, really bad time. This was the worst example of fraud we've had. Hendrik Schön did a lot of work on molecular electronics using single molecules devices, building up transistors and different types of device based on around single molecules, and had countless, something like in total 30 Science and Nature papers fabricated. All of it fabricated. Got through peer review time and time again, until one of the reviewers went, hang on, that looks familiar. And they went back and they looked at data from a previous device for a completely different system. They photocopied that and overlaid it on the other, and they saw that the curves agreed all the way down to the noise. And it got through peer review time and time again. If we'd had social media, if we'd had PubPeer, I truly believe that this would have been captured not within 18 months or 2 years or however long it took, within weeks. So I've been embroiled in a debate, and I think it's one of the reasons why I'm speaking here, and I owe a great debt of gratitude to Liz Wager, who's sitting in the audience, for actually recommending that I speak here, and of course to the organisers for the invitation. But we've been embroiled in a long debate about, and I have to stress this, data that isn't fraudulent, to the best of our knowledge, hasn't been fabricated, but it is exceptionally sloppy. Exceptionally sloppy. And it revolves, or is related to, what are called stripes on nanoparticles. And here's a typical image, and here's the artist rendition. You might see a sort of disparity here between what the experimental data is telling you and how that is given that wonderful glossy artist's rendition. And this is a real problem. Here's a cover of one of the journals that featured this work, actually a number of times. And I don't want to go into the details of that. If you're really interested, Google stripy nanoparticles and you'll find stuff there to keep you going for very many times. We have the dubious honor of our paper countering this being the most commented on paper in PubPeer as it stands at the moment. But what I want to, instead of criticizing this work, what I really want to point out is this: the key importance of iconography and imagery in modern scientific storytelling. Headline will trump rigor. We all know that if you want to get a paper into Science and Nature, the difficult hurdle is not the peer review. It's not the reviewers who can, that can be a tricky process, but the real hurdle is, can I convince the editor that this is newsworthy enough? That's the real hurdle. And instead of all those things that Ottoline pointed out in terms of what researchers see as the hallmark of high quality research, in terms of rigor, originality, in terms of the overall degree to which the work has been carried out systematically and carefully, if you want to get that newsworthiness, generally what that involves is selling a very positive result, and also trying to sweep under the carpet anything negative. So much so that many of you will be aware of this. Randy Schekman, Nobel Prize winner, declared a boycott of the top science journals a couple of years ago. Said he was no longer going to send his work there. I would love to be able to do that. But if I were to do that, I may as well turn around to the postdocs and PhD students in the group and go, well, we're not going to focus on those journals anymore. You may as well go and find a job elsewhere. Because if I, as a PI, say that we're not going to target those journals, I am completely wrecking. I'm a hypocrite. I am completely wrecking the career pathway for those early career researchers in the group. Shackman is I think it's great that he did this, but he's in a position that not many of us are in. Let me flip through this, but this is a very interesting, very timely study. I fool millions into thinking chocolate helps weight loss. Here's how. This was picked up in the UK very quickly by the Daily Mail. If any of you know the UK press, you'll know what a bastion of high-quality journalism the Daily Mail is. So it's perhaps not surprising that they picked up on it so quickly. But here's another great example where newsworthiness really completely tops rigor. And a number of different outlets, lots and lots of publicity, lots and lots of press, including, sad to say, the Irish Examiner. Retraction was picked up in this, and what I really want to point out is this key bit in yellow. Given that the author himself says the study is meaningless, clearly the journal will retract it. Yes, not necessarily given what we've seen in the past. This is key. Often the journals will kick up a stink if the author themselves goes, we want to retract this paper. Why? Because it affects the journal brand. They don't want to have retracted papers. Oh, and so as part of that stripy nanoparticle debacle, which is still sort of dragging on, we tried to submit our paper, which ended up in PLOS 1. Very, very happy with PLOS 1. We tried to submit our paper to a number of the journals that had actually published the original papers, because we thought that was the natural place for it to go. Here's the response from one of them, which I still find shocking. Dear Dr. Moriarty, oh yes, let's slay that particular elephant in the room. It is Professor Moriarty. Quite what Conan Doyle had against the surname, I don't know, but there you go. Thank you for your note and inquiry. However, our journal does not, notice the capitalization, does not publish papers that rely only on existing published data. In other words, our journal does not publish papers that correct, correlate, reinterpret, or in any way use existing published literature data. In other words, our journal, and this is no sort of predatory journal, this is a very prestigious journal who, for the sake of their blushes, I'll not name and shame, basically is saying, we don't do the scientific method. We're not interested in the scientific method. Shocking. It took 3 years for the first criticism of the stripy nanoparticle work to get into press. 3 years. All the while, an awful lot of this work is getting out there, picking up lots and lots of citations, grants are based on it, projects are based on it, and PhD students may be trying to reproduce stuff that they're never, ever going to be able to reproduce. Okay, another show of hands. I ask this question of when I give scientific talks and sort of in my research field, and generally I get, in an audience, say of 100, I'd probably get 2 hands. How many of you have heard of PubPeer? Oh, still, for this conference, that's nowhere near what I expected. Okay, if you haven't heard of PubPeer, go out there and just Google it, and you'll find lots and lots of stuff about PubPeer. It's a wonderful site. It has its problems, which I'll come to. But what it allows is public peer review, online peer review, of pretty well any paper that has a DOI. And one of its most high-profile cases was, as you can see, high-profile stem cell papers under fire. Again, these made it through the peer review process. You might be familiar with the STAP case from last year in terms of these stressed stem cells, these chemically stressed stem cells. And yet, the peer review, the PubPeer community was on it within days. You get post. What we had was we submitted our paper to the archive, which for some of you physicists have something called the archive, which is a preprint server, which is very heavily used, not so much in my field of condensed matter, but very heavily used in astronomy and particle physics. We put our paper there, and it picked up quite a large number of comments in terms of pre-publication review, long before it got to PLOS 1. And this is where I get into the sociology of this, and though I'm definitely not a sociologist, this was upsetting for us. The author and the PI and all that work we were critiquing, basically said in an article in Science, in a news article in Science on the entire debacle, that we were acting like cyberbullies, and he felt just like teenagers do when they're put under online pressure. Now, I really don't want to, sort of spend too much time on this particular aspect of it, because I'm very well aware that the PI isn't here to put his particular case. But if you do work that's publicly funded and you publish it in the public domain, then I think you should really expect that people will feel that they have the right to criticize that work publicly. I can't read that. Oh, 10 minutes. Oh, wow, good. Sorry about that. And this gives rise, from the people who are being criticized and also the people who are doing the critique. There's a big issue here, and I was talking with Ottoline just before she spoke, and I think this is the core issue with post-publication or peer review and public online peer review. How do we handle the issue of anonymity? That's the key thing. Because if you say that all comments have to be signed, which is something that I am in a position to do because I'm, sort of at the, no longer in that early career researcher position of desperately trying to find the next job or whatever. We don't have tenure in the UK, but once you're in a permanent academics position, once you've got a chair, you're much more secure, let's put it, than when you're a postdoc and you've got 6 months until the end of your next contract. So this was an article in Science. As you can see, the web's faceless judges. Faceless, fearless, and vitriolic. So the argument from, as I said, the cyberbullying argument is that, and the claim we've had from those authors and the collaborators is that what you should do is do this the proper way. What you're doing is wrong. You should be doing this via letters to the editor, and those should be going out to peer review. You should not be subverting the traditional peer review system. I have major problems with that because we've seen how that doesn't work. In one case, it took 3 years to get the criticism through, and in another case, when we even tried to publish that criticism, approached the journals, not even to say, please send this out to review, as a pre-publication sort of query, they come back to us and say, no, we're not going to publish work that challenges any of the work published in our pages. We have major problems with peer review. So this is it, the anonymity issue. If you make it, as PubPeer does, that anybody can comment, they have something called unregistered submissions, where you do not have to put your name or do not even have to register at the site, then that is great if, for example, you're an early career researcher and you're challenging the results of a well-established group. You do not want to put your head above the parapet. However, the problem is this. If you have unregistered submissions, then what you have is the opportunity for a great deal of sock puppetry, a great deal of accounts being set up that can be used to generate the feeling of real debate, despite the fact, I'll come to what the Gish Gallop is in a second, despite the fact that really there isn't a debate there. For people outside the field looking at this, they might think, well, actually, there's a to and fro here, despite the fact that what's happening is that you're getting the same type of arguments being put across from multiple accounts. The Gish Gallop, for those of you who don't know, is a creationist ploy whereby you basically set up a slew or a slurry of different of very weak arguments that can be challenged, but the problem is to challenge those takes a lot of time, and then you go through the round again. And this type of Gish Gallop is very interesting. Also, of course, with anonymity comes the possibility of anybody challenging work which may well be entirely fine, and they may well have an axe to grind. How do we deal with that? I don't know. If you know, please tell me, because I honestly think this type of post-publication peer review, I think things like PubPeer are really the future of peer review. They have to be the future of peer review. And I think they'll become de rigueur for the next generation of physicists, wow, that was a slip, of scientists. But how do we get past this problem of anonymity? How do we fix things? And as I said, it's not just a question of fraudulent, it's a question of stuff being sloppy. The word that's been used throughout this conference rather than faulty is sloppy. How do we fix it? I think the publishers are a bit of a barrier. Sorry to the publishers here. So this is from Guardian, slightly better quality journalism in the UK than the Daily Mail, from somebody called George, who's never a man for understatement. And as you can see, how are we doing? Is that 1 minute? 5 minutes, okay, thank you. Academic publishers make Murdoch look like a socialist. Oh, I love that headline. And why? Well, let's look at the profit margins. Come on. Oh, well, before we do that, and I know, I've seen the stall outside, I know Elsevier are here, or at least the literature is here. Elsevier could be said to be one of the problems, and there's something called the cost of knowledge boycott, set up by Tim Gowers, Cambridge mathematician. As you can see, Elsevier and Springer, as well as a number of other commercial publishers, all exploit or volunteer labour to extract very large profits from the academic community. That's one issue. As you can see, Philip Campbell, editor-in-chief of Nature, estimates his journal's internal costs, and if there's anybody from MPG here, please explain this to me, at 20k to 30k, or in dollars, 30k to 40k per paper. And you go to the literature, and no matter what they try and do to push up those costs, they find that really the very most they're going to get, and I still would quibble with those, is off the order of 3k. Where the heck does 20k per paper come from? And we can look at the profit margins of the publishers. They're through the roof. Why are they through the roof? Because we do an awful lot of the work for them. And here's the killer question, and I'm going to be finishing up soon. So, given that, for all the reasons I've discussed, publishers are an issue, why don't we just publish everything in open access journals? The nanotechnology community is particularly lucky in this regard because there's something called the Beilstein Journal of Nanotechnology, entirely open access, no fee to the author, can be downloaded. It's just a fantastic initiative, but of course the Beilstein Foundation has rather deep pockets. Or why don't we have an archive where we combine the best of PubPeer with the best of the archive and allow online? Here's why. We pay for the brand. And we've outsourced, and Ottiline made this point, this extremely important point. We've outsourced our quality control mechanisms to Nature and Science. I've lost count of the number of committee meetings, panel meetings I've sat in, where we're considering the CVs of a new lecturer, early career research, or people applying for those type of appointments. One panel member will turn to the other and she'll say, this person's got much better publications than Dr. Y. How do you know? Have you read them? No. What you've done is you've said, well, published in Nature, they've published in Science. Must be quality. And do those journals publish an awful lot of really good science? Yes, they do. Do other journals publish an awful lot of really good science? Yes, they do. We pay for the brand. Stephen Curry. It's a great shame Stephen isn't at this conference. I strongly recommend you invite him to the next one. So he's a researcher. Again, he's sort of was a physicist. His background is a physicist, which is maybe why I'm a little bit more familiar with him than others. But he's got this fantastic blog post called Sick of Impact Factors. And he talks about the statistical illiteracy of impact factors. Read it. I'm running out of time, but read that blog post and the follow-ups. And this. This is from Richard Zare, who was the head of the Department of Chemistry at Stanford, and basically makes exactly the point that Ottiline was making in terms of when we're researching quality, it's a qualitative thing. I thought that was great. And I really wish that we put aside this stupid idea that we can assess people on things like H-index or the impact factor of the journal where they've published. We need to reevaluate how we evaluate. Thank you for your time. Sorry for such a rant.
Very interesting and provocative speech. So afterwards, You disagree with him, catch him outside and talk to him about that. So that's the way forward there. Now you've heard from two British academics, now academics in the British system. We now cross the Atlantic and go to America, and it's my pleasure to invite Zoe Hammett, the head of ORI, Washington, D.C., to address us.
Thank you, Tony. And I would first like to correct you. I'm not the head of ORI. We have an acting director, Dr. Donald Wright, and Susan Garfinkel, our Division of Investigative Oversight Director, who is here with me, my beloved colleague and friend. And I am the new director of the Division of Education and Integrity. So I don't want to be more of a heavyweight than I really am. I've actually just joined ORI a year ago and am new to this field, so I thought in giving this presentation when Melissa Anderson asked me to speak about the drivers of research misconduct from the perspective of ORI, that I would actually let the case files speak for themselves. So for the most part, that's what I'm going to do. And I would like to acknowledge my wonderful postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Raju Tamot, who has collected the data from our Division of Investigative Oversight database and also prepared the slides for me, as well as Dr. John Dahlberg, our former deputy director who just retired a month ago, who has also contributed to this talk, as well as Susan for her insightful comments late last night. So just to give you, before we begin, a little context for those of you who aren't as familiar with the Office of Research Integrity, it was created by Congress in 1992 as an independent entity to address regulatory oversight in institutions around the country receiving public health service research funds. And we have our two divisions, as I mentioned. Susan handles the investigative oversight and has a team of about 9 investigative scientists who review cases and assessing whether ORI will recommend making a finding. And my division handles educational resources, such as the lab and the research clinic, which are videos available online. I know it's in Spanish, perhaps we should put it in Portuguese. And the assurance program, which also requires those institutions receiving public health service funds to promise to ORI that they will, number one, maintain institutional policies and procedures for handling allegations of research misconduct, and number two, submit annual reports regarding misconduct activity at their institution. So we wanted just to give you an overview of the number of research misconduct cases handled by ORI. And as Susan mentioned to me last night, the average has remained fairly stable over the years. About 400 allegations will come in, resulting in about 50 cases. And then findings average about 10 to 15 a year. So this has maintained a stability over the years. So the dark blue is those inquiries and investigations opened by ORI in response to either direct allegations coming to ORI or allegations being reported as part of a beginning of an investigation at the institutional level. And the light blue represents those cases that result in findings, which you'll find made public on our website. Looking at the closed cases by rank, this is interesting that it really parallels what Otalin was describing from the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, where more cases are brought against senior faculty, but actually more findings are made against the juniors. So the dark blue represents cases brought against professor, associate professor, assistant, and then becoming more junior as you go down the spectrum on the x-axis. And the light blue represents the findings that are made. So while more cases are brought against professors, less findings are made. And Susan has postulated, given her 12 years of experience in reviewing cases, that this is likely due to the control that a senior professor or PI will have over the laboratory environment, particularly when an allegation of research misconduct arises. In other words, if there is an opportunity to make the data disappear prior to sequestration, that is more likely to happen on behalf of a senior professor. and conversely, that junior faculty will be less likely to want to testify against a senior professor, so that in meeting the evidentiary requirements, it's more difficult against the senior faculty. I will not attempt to be an expert in this field, but just wanted to acknowledge that many scholars have debated about the causes of misconduct, and just provide for you some of the ones that we reviewed in preparation for this talk, most of which have been confirmed by the case files in ORI. So we'll look at this in a slightly different context, and this parallels what Lex Buder talked about this morning with the system, the culture, and the individual. It's really simply categorizing it in a slightly different way. We obviously have poor mentorship, competitive pressures, individual psychology and circumstances, and inadequate training, all of which has been discussed to great length. The heart of these research misconduct cases allows us to look at ORI case findings, closed cases in instances where respondents admitted to having committed the misconduct. So each of these quotes that I am now going to illustrate for you are in cases where the respondent admitted. And again, this can be real or perceived, but it's interesting to note that the various characters in the institutional misconduct proceeding will affirm the statements of the respondents in most cases. This graduate student noted that my data was never once reviewed by any of the co-authors, although I offered on several occasions to review the analysis of my data with my mentor and co-authors. All of these offers were uniformly declined. And ORI concurred with this conclusion, noting that this lack of supervision may have been a factor contributing to the misconduct. David Wright's paper in 2008 also reviewed closed ORI case files and found that 3/4 of mentors did not review the source data in those cases against research trainees who were found guilty of misconduct. An investigation committee has similar statements to say that the respondent was not required to present primary data, leading to an obvious oversight failure, and a postdoctoral fellow respondent interestingly noted, my mentor draws diagram every morning about experiment. He showed me also every morning what data will be. I did admit that it was impossible for me to get those demand data. For save my job, I did that. And we purposely did not edit this to allow the respondent to speak in their own words. This research assistant responded in a draft inquiry report at the institutional level. I'm sorry if it's too small to read. The essence is that I was scared to go to him due to the fact that he used to scream and yell at me when things did not work as planned. So the fear factor that Philip mentions with great enthusiasm is also reflected in the ORI files. Competitive pressures are obvious. Pressure to publish in high-profile journals, pressure self-imposed, as well as alteration of data to appease the reviewers and to obtain faculty positions and secure tenure. Some of the personal circumstances are also illuminating. A graduate student noted, I was under a great deal of stress and trying to balance a lot of different things and keep up a good front and not let anyone know anything was wrong. Postdoctoral fellow noted that these events impaired his or her ability to judge right from wrong. And questions about psychological depression, loss of loved ones, and a combination of events, even a natural disaster, were given as reasons contributing to the perpetuated misconduct. In this last quote, I want to point your attention to particularly the respondent, as described by the inquiry panel, had been applying for a green card and felt pressured to make a good paper and get good publications. And in fact, when I spoke with Dr. John Dahlberg about this, he emphasized that that was one of the most consistent things that we have seen in ORI closed case files, that these pressures, particularly because we have about half of the biomedical researchers in the US hailing from countries outside the US, there are obvious cultural differences. This graduate student probably exclaimed that he or she wanted to get out of grad school so badly that I would do anything. Having attended law school, I can empathize with that one. A research technician, but it was my anxiety to please you and impress you, blind my judgment in being an honest and ethical scientist. I was not set to destroy you or your lab. It was my eagerness to impress you, make me a good student or son in front of you. And Tony was just saying to me before we began that his son started in computer science and then went off to be a banker, and actually said to him that he felt he might be somehow shaming his father for leaving science and academia, and just acknowledging that there are very clear pressures, either real or perceived, in any career path. The final graduate student noted that he was terrified of failing, and so I fabricated a piece of data, in his words. Inadequate training has also been discussed at length and will be over the next several days. The first graduate student was actually from a non-US country. In fact, it was only after Dr. X showed me the definition of scientific misconduct in the university policy that I realized I had committed misconduct. And the second postdoctoral fellow was from outside the US, within the US. When I came to the university, I was told that I would get the proper training, education, and most importantly, mentorship that would prepare me to be an independent scientist. The sad thing is, after 2 years of a postdoctoral fellowship, I still don't know how to properly publish Western blot data. This quote, being a green hand from a different culture background in the research work, I had been ignorant about rules of scientific ethics. I hear echoed throughout our sessions where it's not just the scientists, but the administrators, the stakeholders involved in all of these discussions. So clearly it's a wonderful thing that we're all here to engage and debate on how best to promote integrity through research rewards and improving systems. The final on inadequate training is that the investigation committee noted that the respondent didn't understand that a poster presentation actually demanded the same level of accuracy, truthful reporting, and obviously quality as a published work, as if there were a sliding scale in the need for quality. This final quote was intriguing to me when I found it actually on a science blog, quoting a Davis paper from 2007. An honest investigator should be able to deal effectively with the traditional publish or perish pressures. The loss of my ability to be an objective scientist cannot be linked to defects in the system under which I worked. Part of what is intriguing about this is that when we are talking about responsible conduct of research training, and we recognize that some people will come to the class, I have taught these courses and think many of them are glassy-eyed and they want their certificate at the end and you wonder whether you've reached them or not. And others may not have any intent of committing the misconduct, but as we've said, there are tremendous amount of pressures that will lead people to do things they may not have otherwise done. But one thing I do know is, as a research integrity officer, after having done my responsible conduct of research training sessions, I inevitably had a 100% increase of people coming to my office and knocking on my door and even bringing hypotheticals or concerns, many of which were along the lines of these undesirable or questionable research practices, not necessarily FFP, but raising awareness through the responsible conduct of research training was clearly a positive result. This last slide happens to be a rhododendron, which Raju Tamot our postdoctoral fellow, included, and he wanted me to tell you all that this is the national flower of Nepal, from where he hails. And interestingly, this morning I was intrigued by Lex Buder's enthusiasm about this utopian world where senior scientists are serving as exemplary models and magnificent mentors, and transparency is reducing waste and promoting integrity around the world. And I asked Susan prior to this session, well, what is the symbol of the rhododendron? What does it mean? Often a flower will have a symbolism in certain cultures, and it means caution or beware. So I think perhaps following on Lex Buder's optimism about our utopian world and idealism, I would just encourage us all to proceed with cautious optimism. Thank you very much.
So that brings us to the end of this plenary, but it's, I think we've had 3 very stimulating presentations. They have raised lots and lots of issues, and I do thank our presenters for the liveliness and interest of those presentations. Interesting, Zoe talked about issues of power relations, and I have a case at the moment in my institution where a graduate student had taken data which belonged really to others, but she had been associated with it, and had published a paper with her supervisor, and this has become an issue. Interestingly, as the graduate student, she put her hand up. I did the wrong thing. She went to the people whose data it was, has personally apologized to them. She has written a long letter to the journal editor to ask to publish a clarification. She has written a letter of contrition to me, which I passed on to our provost. Her supervisor, who said, I didn't really bother to read this and let my name go forward, said, I don't agree with the university's policy that all co-authors should take responsibility. That's an interesting difference and the power relations, so I think that's very important. I think it was extremely challenging issues, and I'm sure my 3 colleagues on the platform would be very happy to talk later with any of you, and I'm sure you've got lots of questions. And given what Philip was saying, I really cannot resist saying, thank you, Professor Moriarty. So with that, let me ask you to thank our presenters in the usual way. Thank you.